If I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times. Blackwashing just isn't a thing. You know what is though? The whitening of African soldiers during World War II. You'd think with posts like these that black people hadn't been invented yet.
So what are you saying? Black people hadn't been invented yet?
Never mind the 200,000 black Americans who were sent to Europe, the 500,000 Africans in British service, the 15,000 black men in the British West Indies Regiment, or the 200,000 African soldiers who fought for France on the Western Front. Black folks didn't just pop out of thin air after 1945. They did indeed exist during both world wars and were actually instrumental in bringing victory to the Allied forces. But why is it then that we never hear their stories, or that when we do, it's met with vitriol? Of course, part of it boils down to this, but also, and more importantly, a sort of deliberate amnesia that stems from a refusal by the West to confront its colonial history. So I'm gonna shine a big light on it, and do so by focusing on the African soldiers who fought for France during both world wars. There have been books written on it, movies made depicting it, and today, well, I'm talking about it. Of all the Allied forces, France is the one that took full advantage of the manpower of its colonies and worked overtime to raise their contributions, but we'll get to that in a bit. France already had a habit of recruiting West Africans. In the 17th century, so way before the Great War, early recruitment actually heavily depended on the slave trade. The French military would pay enlistment bonuses directly to enslavers, who would then release their slaves to the military. Essentially, the military would repurchase the enslaved for X amount of years of service in the army, and although this practice officially ended in 1882, I'd venture to say that other coercive tactics took its place. See, by the mid-19th century, the train of European colonization started choo-chooing its way across the African continent, and the French realized that they simply didn't have the manpower required for their colonial needs. There were simply not enough French troops to control the territory. Oh no, what to do? Enter colonial administrator and military governor of Senegal, Louis Faidherbe. In 1857, to answer the problem at hand, he formed the first regiment of what would come to be known as the tirailleurs senegalais. These indigenous units became an integral part of the colonial army, and their expansion actually continued throughout the rest of the country. While they were called Senegalese Tirailleurs, because that's where they were first formed, they actually came to be made up of soldiers from across West Africa and other countries like Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, basically any and all African country under French colonial rule. But remember those coercive tactics I briefly mentioned?
Although this practice officially ended in 1882, I'd venture to say that other coercive tactics took its place.
Well, that's pretty much how they got most African men to join. Colonial officials and/or their African intermediaries would destroy village crops and livestock if they refused to comply, take loved ones hostage, or imprison uncooperative recruits. And when World War I broke out, these recruitment tactics only intensified. I'm not saying that volunteerism wasn't a thing, it very much was, but even so-called volunteers were subject to some form of coercion. When you've got a power dynamic as lopsided as that of the colonizer and the colonized, what constitutes free will? Can one's choice to enlist really be considered free? Let me know what you think, because that's an interesting discussion. But anyways, during World War I, France brought in about 200,000 West African troops and sent about 130,000 of them to the Western Front. They did so because, well, France was losing, and losing bad. The staggering losses suffered by the French army during the first 22 months of the Great War kind of forced them to tap into the manpower of their West African colonies. In his 1910 essay, La Force Noire, or The Black Force, French General Charles Mongean had already talked about the inexhaustible reservoir of men on the African continent that could guarantee French security in the event of a war. All the French needed to do was tap in, so to speak. So in Senegal alone, more than 1/3 of men of military age were mobilized. In places like Mali, young men were marched with ropes around their necks to the recruiting stations. And an account by a Senegalese man named Yuli Missine speaks of recruits, forced to join against their will, jumping once they lost sight of their home homeland. Recruitment was erratic, but the French colonial administration didn't care, as long as they had the men they needed. The tirailleurs senegalais thus served in important battles and actually saw a great deal of combat, so much so that their casualty rates were disproportionately high compared to overall French rates. See, the tirailleurs were often deployed as attacking shock troops. It was believed that the primitive savagery of West Africans made them ideal for offensive and rapid frontal assaults, and that way of thinking had dire consequences. The tirailleurs fought heroically, but sadly, about 30,000 of them were killed and tens of thousands more were wounded. And post-war, the damaging socio-economic effects of recruitment were heavily felt throughout French West Africa. Not to mention that on French soil, the sacrifices made by African soldiers were swept under the rug. Their physical devotion to the motherland mattered not, as in the eyes of colonial France, it was French leadership that had brought victory, and thus French leadership that deserved to be awarded. As such, French colonial administrators and French military commanders were listed by name and lauded for their exploits, while recruited African soldiers remained anonymous. Remember that French general Charles Mongat and his talks of untapped black manpower? Well, he had a statue raised in his honor, while the black manpower he talked about remained nameless. The tirailleurs senegalais effectively had no one to speak for them. Historian Shelby Cullum Davis put it best, saying, quote, "A history of the Senegalese Tirailleurs of French West Africa is seen only through French eyes. Despite over 300,000 black tirailleurs and over 1 million fathers, mothers, wives, and sweethearts whose lives have been intimately affected by the influence, often indirect, of the French recruiting agent." The French had proclaimed that French victory was a victory for Africa and would lead to prosperity for all, but really, all it left on the African continent was a standing colonial institution, a broken socioeconomic landscape, PTSD, and most of all, resentment amongst African soldiers. For example, Saran Ndiaye, a Senegalese man forced to join the army by his father, became physically disabled as a result of the war and, quote, "remained lastingly embittered toward the French, who, he recalled, failed to even teach him the rudiments of their language while he was in their army." Of course, certain tirailleurs had better experiences than others and had relationships, be it amicable or sexual, with Europeans, but discrimination remained rife throughout World War I and actually got worse during World War II. See, once World War II broke out, France once again called upon the tirailleurs senegalais, so much so that they comprised roughly 9% of the army. And because they were so visible, racist caricatures about them began circulating, especially in Germany. The Nazis hated the tirailleurs. Unsurprising, I know, because they were Nazis. But another reason the Nazis couldn't stand these African soldiers was because they had taken part in the Allied occupation of Rhineland after World War I. The fact that the French had stationed black people in German land was, in their eyes, seen as racial humiliation. And so, when the Nazis took power, they circulated racist and false propaganda about how the Senegalese were committing widespread rapes on German women. And during the war, they routinely massacred West African troops for sport. Being black while at war meant that violence was always sprinkled with a healthy dose of discrimination. And that was true of the enemy and the ally. Within the French army, the tirailleurs simply weren't treated like their white counterparts. Their pay was smaller, as were their food rations, and their uniforms were not only different, but made of inferior fabric. Not to mention that their training was inadequate, and no provisions were given to withstand the colder climate of Europe. But again, the French didn't care, so long as they had black bodies defending their motherland. Really, on top of being made to fight for a country that wasn't their own, the tirailleurs also had to deal with racial injustice on all sides. So you can only imagine the indignation when the French literally tried whitening their troops and erasing African contribution. See, when victory was close for the Free French forces in World War II, General Charles de Gaulle ordered un blanchiment, a whitening of sorts, and replaced 20,000 Africans at the front lines with white Frenchmen.
Le blanchiment est une opération qui va consister à retirer les soldats africains noirs qui sont alors sur le front dans l'est de la France en octobre et novembre 1944.
Yes, the tirailleurs were literally brought back from the front lines, undressed, and had their clothes distributed to white soldiers.
On a donné tous nos effets et on nous a donc rapatriés
dans le Midi.
Then they were sent to camps in the south of France because the government didn't want them associated with the liberation and have them seen celebrating throughout the country. And as if that wasn't enough, the army refused to give them back pay or visas for their involvement. Post-war, the tirailleurs were really just treated like crap. They were shipped back to their countries, never spoken of again, and that led straight to the Tirailleur massacre, a protest in which 35 Africans were killed and hundreds more wounded. See, on the 30th of November 1944, in a camp in Tirailleur, Senegal, Senegalese Tirailleurs mutinied over French mistreatment and the fact that they hadn't been paid. The French had promised back pay when they sent the tirailleurs back home. However, it quickly became apparent that they weren't gonna uphold their end of the bargain. So the African soldiers revolted, and in retaliation, the French shot as many as 300 of them. Not much else is known about what happened that night because it's shrouded in secrecy. I mean, even though France acknowledged 35 deaths, we still don't know how many Africans were really killed because the survivors were paid off. All of that and everything I talked about played a part in the erasure of the tirailleurs, which is why after the war they mostly fell into obscurity. France never really acknowledged their role in that erasure, and that actually continued well on into the 21st century, with President Nicolas Sarkozy saying in 2007, "The tragedy of Africa is that the African has not fully entered into history."
Le drame de l'Afrique, c'est que l'homme africain n'est pas assez entré dans l'histoire.
Mind you, he said that during a speech in Dakar, the capital of Senegal, the place that birthed the Senegalese Tirailleurs. Matter of fact, it's only thanks to Jamel Debbouze's 2006 movie Indigène that pensions for African soldiers were finally unfrozen and rightfully handed out. Yes, it's only some 60 years after the war that some African soldiers were granted their retirement funds. And notice I said some. Many former tirailleurs actually struggled to get by and for a long time couldn't understand how a country they helped defend would treat them and their descendants with such contempt. Part of that was because the African experience in Europe was, for a long while, only seen through European eyes. The collective experiences of the colonized were fraught with European prejudices, and it's really only when oral history became an accepted research technique that hidden truths about France's colonial past emerged. These hidden truths challenged accepted French beliefs, and that's when we start seeing the country distance itself, or at least try to, from its past. Add to that the cultural and physical decolonization that swept Africa in the mid to late 1900s, and you've got a former colonial power refusing to come to terms with its colonial past. But that's not what I'm gonna end on. While France has tried to erase African contribution during both world wars, I applaud the bravery and resilience of the young African men who suffered the consequences. And although most, if not all, of them are gone today, their memories live on through the books written on them, the movies depicting them, and now this video talking about them.